Mark, can you tell us, as best you can, the story of the Jamaican Maroons?
The Maroons. Well, I'm not a historian, but I will attempt to give you a fair summary. I hope I don't make any crucial errors. The first European settlers of Jamaica were the Spanish, who came. Columbus was the first guy from Europe to come to Jamaica, and the Spanish settled there, and they they started the sugar industry, and they brought African slaves to Jamaica, some of whom claimed their freedom by escaping from the farms and plantations to the rugged mountains of Jamaica. Jamaica has a very mountainous terrain. There's a sort of spine of mountains that runs from end to end, and they were able to live in that environment and as free people. In 1655, the British came to Jamaica. They were looking for commercial prospects, in what was perceived to be a valuable area of the world to have a commercial interest. And they ended up fighting a 4-year war with the Spanish to conquer Jamaica. In that war, incidentally, they were struggling until the Maroons, led by a man called Juan de Bolas, who was a Maroon leader, who had originally sided with the Spanish against the British who were coming in, changed allegiances. And with the help of the Maroons, they drove out the Spanish, and Jamaica became a British colony. And then that was in 1655, and after that, the sugar industry really started to take off. Jamaica quite soon became the leading colony in the British Empire in terms of the production of sugar, and the plantation system really worked itself to the fullest in Jamaica. It was a very brutal system. I believe, for example, that the approach of the planters was really, rather than encouraging the reproduction by the slaves that were imported from Africa, they worked them to death, essentially, with average lifespan, I think, was 8 years. So I was reading something yesterday, actually, where they're saying more slaves were imported into Jamaica than the United States, although the population in the United States of African descent became much bigger because the approach was different. But in Jamaica, over the years, more slaves were imported than to the United States. Anyway, the Maroons continued. The existing Maroons from the Spanish time, their numbers grew as slaves sought their freedom and took advantage of the terrain of Jamaica. And the British were constantly trying to manage that process by fighting skirmishes with the Maroons and so on, who would perhaps have raiding parties from time to time that would pillage or whatever plantations to get guns or whatever it might be that they needed. And eventually there was a war or a series of wars which resulted in eventually in a treaty being signed, two treaties, because there were two bands of Maroons. There were the Windward Maroons to the east and the Leeward Maroons to the west. And one of our national heroes, our only female national heroine, Nanny of the Maroons, I believe she wasn't in favor of signing a treaty with the British that would result in any kind of compromise, which the British were seeking for the Maroons to get autonomy and freedom, but play a role in maintaining the stability of Jamaica and the slave system. But after her death, the other leaders saw it necessary to arrive at that, at a compromise, and signed a treaty which gave the Maroons lands that were essentially theirs. They had sovereignty of sorts over those lands. They were enforced their own laws over those lands, and they were not to be troubled by the British. But in exchange, they were to return slaves who runaway slaves, and they were to perform the role of a sort of auxiliary police force if there was an insurrection that would help maintain order.
So they become an auxiliary force of the colonial government.
Essentially, and that was a price for their own freedom, and they having signed that, they lived up to it. So, for example, in the 1860s, the Tacky Revolt, which was a very serious insurrection led by a Coromantee slave who was a warrior chief in Africa, came to Jamaica. He was enslaved, came to Jamaica, and he led a rebellion in a parish called St. Mary, which was a very serious and well-planned rebellion, and was spreading. And it was the Maroons who contained that. And in fact, Tacky was shot, allegedly, at full speed on the run in the bush by a Maroon captain with a musket, which fires a single bullet. Shot dead by Captain Davy, as he was called. So it was the Maroons who contained that. I mean, I think that Jamaica would have probably had a Haitian-type revolution if it were not for the Maroons. Because even right through, even in 1865, after the emancipation, which took place in the 1838 in Jamaica, where slavery was abolished, but there was poor social conditions for the majority population, and that resulted in an upsurge of protest in an area called St. Thomas, led by a Baptist deacon called Paul Bogle, who's another one of our national heroes, which flared up and became violent, including the response to it by the local militia and so on. And it was the Maroons again who quelled that and brought it under control. So for the entire span after the treaties were signed, the Maroons did live up to their treaty commitments, but by providing that support to the colonial militia when necessary. They did it because it was necessary in order to maintain their own freedom. It's controversial looked at from today's standards, in the sense that I think some people in Jamaica feel that was, disloyal to their African brothers and sisters.
They sold us out.
Yes. But I think one has to look at it in context. And, they were fighting for their own survival and for their own freedom. And so...
And in fact, they gained their freedom.
They gained their freedom. They were the first independent Jamaicans, the Maroons. And...
Am I wrong? They may have been the first successful Caribbean Black Revolution. Haiti comes later.
I think that's a fair characterization of it. I think that is true. And in fact, it was both in Trelawney Town and Accompong, which is the Windward Maroons, I believe, and in Moortown, Charlestown, Scotts Pass, Nannytown in Portland, which is the Windward Maroons, and they signed a treaty. Each one signed a treaty, yes. I think a year or so apart, and that was indeed the first in the Western Hemisphere that African people or people of African descent successfully fought for and gained their freedom, and so from that standpoint, respect is due to the Maroons. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
Mark.